Welcome, I'm Tatiana Darzi. The Department of Commerce announced it added 33 Chinese companies that have a history of human rights violations, are involved with military activities and weapons of mass destruction to an entity list. The businesses in this list will need a license from the Department of Commerce to purchase U.S. technology.
On May 22nd, the U.S. Department of Commerce announced the addition of 33 Chinese companies and agencies to the entity list. Companies and agencies placed on this list are accused of engaging in human rights violations or being involved in military activities which represent a risk to the national security of the United States. Businesses and agencies on the entity list need a license from the Department of Commerce to purchase U.S. technology, making them subject to sanctions. According to the statement released by the U.S. Department of Commerce, 24 governmental and commercial organizations are added to the entity list for engaging in activities contrary to the national security or foreign policy interests of the United States. The entities, based in China, Hong Kong, and the Cayman Islands, represent a significant risk of supporting procurement of items for military end use in China. Some of these organizations are the Beijing Computational Science Research Center, Qihu 360 Technology Company, Beijing Cloudmine Technology Company, and Harbin Engineering University. The United States believes that these government-backed and commercial organizations help the Chinese military in purchasing weapons of mass destruction and military equipment, which represent significant risks to the U.S.
If the U.S. allows China to continue scavenging equipment parts from the U.S. or from other countries, as it has in the past, the Chinese Communist Party would only build its own military to be tougher and stronger, clearly violating the interests of the United States.
Tian Yuan expressed that the U.S. has always examined the exports of military and civil military components, but the CCP has used various methods to avoid examinations and even set up dummy companies in other regions to purchase these components, which were later transferred to China. According to the Department of Commerce, 9 parties are complicit in human rights violations and abuses committed in China's campaign of repression, mass arbitrary detention, forced labor and high-technology surveillance against Uyghurs, ethnic Kazakhs, and other members of Muslim minority groups in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, XUAR. The listing will identify China's Ministry of Public Security's Institute of Forensic Science and Aksu Huafu Textile Co. for engaging in human rights violations and abuses in the XUAR. An additional 7 commercial entities will be added to the list for enabling China's high-technology surveillance in the XUAR, CloudWalk technology. On the day of the release of the list of sanctions by the U.S. Department of Commerce, the CCP announced in the rubber stamp legislation that it would examine Hong Kong's national security law.
This list might have existed for quite some time, and in my opinion, it was released on May 22nd to serve as a warning to the CCP. Everybody knows that this Hong Kong version of national security law is basically the start of one country, one system. In other words, when the so-called national security law is passed, the free and democratic rule of law would completely disappear in Hong Kong.
While sanctioning these companies and individuals hadn't had much impact on blocking this Hong Kong version of the National Security Act, the U.S., judging from the timing of the release of the list, is definitely trying to curb the Hong Kong version of the National Security Act. However, this needs time, and this is just the first step.
A day before the release of the list of sanctions, the U.S. Department of State published a report on its strategic approach to the People's Republic of China. The report acknowledges that the U.S. has underestimated the CCP and that the U.S. policy was largely premised on a hope that deepened engagement would spur fundamental economic and political openings in the PRC and lead to its emergence as a constructive and responsible global stakeholder with a more open society. However, the PRC's rapid economic development and increased engagement with the world did not lead to convergence with a citizen-centric, free and open order, as the United States had hoped. The CCP has chosen instead to exploit the free and open rules-based order and attempt to reshape the international system in its favor. Beijing openly acknowledges that it seeks to transform the international order to align with CCP's interests and ideology. The CCP's expanding use of economic, political, and military power to compel acquiescence from nation-states harms vital American interests and undermines the sovereignty and dignity of countries and individuals around the world. The U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, also acknowledged in a State Department briefing that China has been ruled by a brutal authoritarian communist regime since 1949. For several decades, we greatly underestimated the degree to which Beijing is ideologically and politically hostile to free nations. The whole world is waking up to that fact.
After the release of the United States' strategic approach to the People's Republic of China, related deterrent measures will be implied very soon. This list of sanctions is just a small act. Bigger actions are right behind.
In fact, more and more Chinese companies have been sanctioned by the U.S. over the past year for threatening U.S. national security and for violating human rights. For instance, the U.S. added Huawei and 68 related companies to the entity list for threatening national security in May 2019. And in October of the same year, 28 more Chinese companies and agencies were added to the entity list for violating human rights. These included Xinjiang Public Security Bureau and companies such as Hike Digital Technology, Migville Technology, and Dahua Technology, which are engaged in the research and development of face recognition technology. Recently, the U.S. has also tightened its export ban on Huawei, requiring manufacturers outside the U.S. to also apply for an export license when exporting semiconductor chips made by the U.S. technology to Huawei.
The Chinese regime is threatening retaliation after the Trump administration closed the loophole that allowed Huawei to get around U.S. trade restrictions. In the past, Huawei exploited this loophole in order to get access to advanced U.S. technology.
The Trump administration is closing a loophole that allows Huawei to get around U.S. trade restrictions and get its hands on advanced U.S. technology. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, is threatening retaliation after Washington closed a loophole, one that allowed Huawei to sidestep U.S. export controls and buy semiconductors from global chip makers. Last year, the Trump administration placed restrictions on U.S. companies selling to Huawei. The president didn't want sensitive and advanced U.S. technology powering the Chinese military, which Huawei is linked to, but the telecom giant found a way around the rule. Instead of buying directly from U.S. companies, it would buy from overseas manufacturers licensed to use U.S. technology in their chips. That won't be so easy anymore. All global chip makers will need to obtain a U.S. license before selling to Huawei, and most manufacturers rely on equipment produced by U.S. companies. The CCP is not happy about this. It's threatening to cause trouble for U.S. companies like Apple, Cisco, and Boeing. Huawei needs semiconductors for its smartphones. It's now the second largest manufacturer in the world. It also needs the chips to power its 5G ambitions. President Trump has been telling allies to exclude Huawei gear from their 5G networks because its equipment could be used by China for spying. The new restrictions come amid heightened tensions between Washington and Beijing, triggered by what the United States calls the regime's mishandling of the pandemic.
The Senate passed a bill that would help prevent Chinese companies from committing fraud in the United States. The Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act was passed by unanimous consent and prohibits Chinese companies who have failed to be audited for more than 3 years in a row from being listed on the U.S. stock exchange.
The Senate passed the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act on May 20th, dropping a bomb on the Chinese stock market. The lawmakers who initiated the bill expressed hope that it would help prevent Chinese companies from committing fraud in the United States. The Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, sponsored by Republican Senator John Kennedy and Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen, was passed by unanimous consent on May 21st. According to the act, securities of a company are prohibited from being listed on any of the U.S. securities exchanges if the company has failed to comply with the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board's PCAOB audits for 3 years in a row. Specifically, the bill requires a company to prove it's not owned or controlled by a foreign government if the PCAOB is unable to audit specified reports because the company uses a foreign accounting firm not subject to inspection by the board. John Kennedy, a member of the Senate Banking Committee, tweeted on May 20th that it's asinine we're giving Chinese companies the chance to exploit hard-working Americans because we don't insist on examining their books. I hope the House sends this bill to POTUS to protect Americans and their savings. Kennedy's tweet on Tuesday stated, "The Chinese Communist Party cheats, and the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act would stop them from cheating on U.S. stock exchanges. We can't let foreign threats to Americans' retirement funds take root in our exchanges." Kennedy said in a statement, "There are plenty of markets all over the world open to cheaters, but America can't afford to be one of them." On May 20th, Chinese technology stocks fell on the news, with Alibaba closing down more than 2% and Baidu down 1.12%. The credit history of China concept stocks hasn't been good. Chinese companies listed in the U.S., such as Luckin Coffee, also face increased scrutiny. The Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act still needs to be passed by the House of Representatives and signed by President Trump to become law.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo stated that the West has tolerated the CCP's authoritarian regime for too long, and that now countries around the world are starting to wake up to the nature of the Chinese regime and see it for what it is.
On May 24th, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo expressed that the West has tolerated the CCP's authoritarian regime for far too long, and the virus is making countries better understand the nature of the CCP. He also spoke out against the Australian state of Victoria's plan to sign the Belt and Road Initiative with the CCP, which he said could present real risks. On May 24th, Outsiders, a TV program that airs on Australian Sky News, interviewed Pompeo. He once again criticized the CCP, particularly for fully demonstrating its authoritarian nature during the pandemic.
Those are the things I think the world could see. It saw that the reflex is to cover up, to hide, not to protect and secure and keep safe. Those are the kind of things that authoritarian regimes do by nature.
Pompeo expressed that the West has tolerated the CCP for too long, and that countries around the world are beginning to wake up to the nature of the CCP as a result of the outbreak.
My comments the other day reflected what has been decades of Western tolerance of behaviors that we don't accept from any place else. And the nature of the Chinese Communist Party now, I think, has become clear as a result of this coronavirus.
Moreover, in response to Victoria's plan to sign the Belt and Road project with the CCP, Pompeo said the price of a country's participation could be to make concessions to the CCP, and that to ensure the security of the Five Eyes Alliance intelligence network, the U.S. will simply disconnect with Australia if there are perceived security problems.
But nearly each one of them has some cost to it. There's often money loaned at concessional rates, or conditions placed in the debt documents, or government concessions that have to be made to the Chinese Communist Party in order to get those Belt and Road Initiative projects built. Those present real risk to the people in that region, real risk to your country, and frankly, they build up the capacity of the Chinese Communist Party to do harm.
At the end of his interview, Pompeo emphasized that the CCP's act of blaming other countries for the origin of the virus was not only to deflect international attention, but also to make the Chinese people continuously subservient to the CCP itself.
Local authorities in Jilin City, located in China's northeastern Jilin province, are sending residents to mandatory quarantine sites during China's second wave of CCP virus infections. Residents are expected to pay out of pocket for quarantine hotels, even though they are struggling financially.
While China is going through a second wave of infections, with 90% of Chinese businesses shut down and workers without an income, they are still forced to pay expensive mandatory quarantine expenses at hotels, according to a Jilin businesswoman. Jilin City, the second largest city in China's northeastern Jilin province, was placed under complete lockdown on May 13th after experiencing a sudden increase in CCP virus cases. Local authorities are sending many residents to quarantine sites at their own expense, and people are struggling to pay for it. Miss Yang, who runs a small private company in the city, told the Chinese-language Epoch Times that China's economy is paralyzed by the pandemic, and life is particularly tough for ordinary citizens in hard-hit regions. A Twitter user said that, as far as he knows, quarantine fees can range from 6,860 to 8,286 yuan, which is $967 to $1,168.
All restaurants and all hotels are shut down. People are all staying at home. The outbreak is very serious. Everyone is afraid of getting infected. Actually, my company losses are not the worst. Those shops, restaurants, spas, karaoke bars, and other bars have lost all their customers. Their losses are huge. If I don't have enough savings, where can I get the money to buy what I need? There are no government subsidies whatsoever. Even when we need to be quarantined, we must pay for the quarantine costs. Everyone has to quarantine in hotels. No one is allowed to self-quarantine at home. In hotels, the cost is 350 yuan, $49 USD per day. I can tell you that China's economy is paralyzed from the pandemic. 90% of companies and businesses are paralyzed. All operations have stopped, except for large-scale state-run enterprises. And even for state-run enterprises, production output is halved. So ordinary people don't have jobs and don't have any income. The only stores that are open are grocery stores and farmers markets. Now only a few farmers markets are open. Only those grocery stores are operating as usual because people have to buy food, vegetables, and fruits anyway. Even pharmacies are closed, as they are forbidden to sell anti-inflammatory drugs or fever medicines. Many local hospitals are supposed to treat COVID-19 patients only and ask all other patients to leave. At least one hospital has been vacated to get ready for this. In addition, many hotels are used as quarantine sites. We have seen buses taking patients to these hotels. Each bus is loaded with patients. They come one after another. The authorities are not reporting the true infection figures because the true figures will cause people to panic. But we are more alert this time because this is the second round of outbreak. During the first round, we were not fully aware as to how serious it can be. Now we are on high alert because it has already become a global pandemic and we know it could happen right where we are. Last time, we thought Wuhan is so far away from our province, and we should be relatively safe. Now we see how serious it is. See, the whole city is on lockdown.
The interview was conducted on May 14th by Chang Chun of the Chinese language Epoch Times.
Jan Jekielek, the host of American Thought Leaders, interviewed Drew Pavlo, a student at the University of Queensland in Australia. Pavlo explains that he called out and protested his university's ties to the Chinese regime. This resulted in physical and verbal attacks by individuals working for the CCP, and now he's possibly facing expulsion.
On the afternoon of that violence, the university was sending emails off to the consulate for review and evaluation before posting. So they were preparing their public statements, sending them to the consulate for review, and then after obtaining, permission by the Chinese consulate, the university was then publishing statements. So the university was coordinating its public relations response to the protest with the Chinese consulate, and they were in close coordination with the Chinese consulate against me and against other students who had supported the Hong Kong side. And the next day, Consul General Zhu Jie, the Chinese Consul General in Brisbane, he put out a statement basically praising the Chinese students who had assaulted us as patriotic. He condemned the protest organizers as separatists. I had been named in the Global Times the day before as the protest organizer, so he was labeling me a separatist. And as we all know, that is a capital penalty. That's one of the highest crimes to the Chinese government. It carries the death penalty in China. So when I was labeled as a separatist, it was in some respects, almost a Chinese government fatwa against me, sort of encouraging people to attack me, threaten me in Brisbane, Australia. I had hundreds of death threats sent to me. My social media was inundated with these threats. The really remarkable fact of all this is the fact that Consul General Zhu Jie, he's not just a diplomat, he was also appointed by the University of Queensland, my university. 1 month before this violence, he was promoted. He was appointed as an honorary professor by the university. He was appointed to faculty. The University of Queensland, in an absolutely unprecedented move, appointed a serving member of the Chinese government to its faculty. And, you know, this was thus a professor at the university encouraging violent attacks against me and other students, endorsing such attacks as patriotic.
To watch the entire video on American thought leaders, please visit the link below. The following charts show you the most recent numbers regarding the CCP virus pandemic. The Chinese Communist Party's cover-up led to a pandemic that now threatens the lives of people around the globe. With over 5.6 million people infected, China is still defensive about independent international inquiry into the origin and spread of the CCP virus. The Epoch Times has initiated a global Sign the Petition campaign calling for investigating, condemning, and rejecting the CCP. We believe that investigating and exposing the truth is the only way that we can remain safe. Let's take action. Sign the petition at ccpvirustruth.com. That's all for today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this program with friends and family to keep them informed about the latest news and updates. Thank you for joining me. See you next time.